Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wassalam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallama tasliman kathiran amma ba'd. So for those of us who are joining us for the first time, this is part 2 of the topic at hand, which is dealing with the aspect of impure water, or water that is in and of itself clean and pure, but has an element of an impurity, something of urine or feces, for example, blood, that is introduced into the water, and whether or not it makes the water impure, the differences of the scholars with regards to the verdicts that they have arrived at. And that's because of the different ahadith that are narrated on these issues or in this issue, and how they are making sense of them. So just to read that last sentence from the last paragraph, Imam Ibn Rushd rahmatullahi alayhi says, فَرَامَ الْعُلَمَاءُ الْجَمْعَ بَيْنَ هَذِهِ الْأَحَادِيثِ وَاخْتَلَفُوا فِي طَرِيقِ الْجَمْعِ فَاخْتَلَفَتْ لِذَلِكَ مَذَاهِبُهُم. So the scholars, they basically did their best to combine between these textual sources, these evidences, and because of that, the way in which they tried to make sense between them, they did so in different ways, and because of that they had different viewpoints as a whole. So he then goes on to tell us a little bit about the different ways in which they sought to make sense of these evidences. So he says, فَمَنْ ذَهَبَ إِلَى الْقَوْلِ بِظَاهِرِ حَدِيثِ الْأَعْرَابِي وحديث أبي سعيد رضي الله تعالى عنهم قال إن حديثي أبي هريرة غير معقولي المعنى وامتثال ما تضمناه عبادة لا لأن ذلك الماء ينجس. He says, so when we look at in the way that the scholars sought to combine and make sense of the different ahadith, he says those of the scholars who looked at the hadith of the Bedouin who urinated in the masjid and then they poured water over it, as well as the hadith of Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, which is the hadith that deals with the well, that well in which they drank from it, while at the same time they threw all sorts of different impurities of blood, of human waste within it. He says that those scholars who took those ahadith into consideration, they're saying that the hadith itself is غير معقول المعنى, meaning that the ruling itself is not something that intellectually, rationally, that we can make sense of it, but rather it is something that is purely religious. So even though a person may say logically, rationally, hey, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense, or perhaps that's still something that's probably going to be impure, or who knows what. He's saying the religion is not looking at it from that perspective. It's giving us a religious interpretation. And the religious interpretation, according to these scholars, is saying that the water, it does not become impure because of what is introduced into it of these defilements. So to be clear on that first point. And then he goes on to say, حتى إن الظاهرية أفرطنا في ذلك فقالت لو صب البول إنسان في ذلك الماء من قدح لما كره الغسل به والوضوء. He says, in interpreting this within a religious approach and perspective, he says the Zahiriyya, once again, that's the madhab that if we paid attention to them, we would realize that these are the folks who take everything at the literal view with regards to Islamic law. And they went ahead and they exaggerated in this aspect of interpreting this as being something that is a religious interpretation, nothing that is rational and logical. That if a person were to urinate in some type of a container and pour that container which has the urine into the still body of water, that it does not make the water impure. So it would not be disliked for them to take anything of a bath in it or to make wudu from it. Mind you, they're referring to the hadith of Abu Hurairah radiallahu ta'ala anhu, or the two ahadith that were mentioned, wherein the Prophet ﷺ said that no one should urinate in a still body of water and then bathe from it or perform wudu from it. So they're looking at it as saying that that's a spiritual thing. What's not allowed is that you directly urinate into it. And that's where they're coming from this, if we could use the word bizarre, the scholar uses exaggerated perspective to say that, so it's just because it's a religious matter, not a rational, logical one, it's a religious one, you're not allowed to directly urinate into it. But if you were to go ahead and urinate into something of, let's say, this container, and then pour this container which has the urine into the still body of water, that pond, that pool, that bucket, whatever it is, it's okay. So that's what the scholar says. He says, فَجَمَعَ بَيْنَهُمَا عَلَى هَذَا الْوَجْهِ مَنْ قَالَ هَذَا الْقَوْلِ. So he's saying, so those scholars who look at these positions, they're in agreement, they're of the same position because of how they are interpreting the text as being a religious one, not something that can be rationally understood, and thereby to have the rulings derived, and to have it understood. Once again, when we look at what the ulama say with regards to the ahkam, they say that there's either one of two categories. Mu'allala, meaning that there are causes and that there are reasons by which we could understand and make sense of the teachings. And then there's other which are غير معقول المعنى, meaning that which we cannot rationalize, we cannot understand. It is a religious, spiritual thing, and we accept it as that without being able to try to rationalize and understand it. Somebody may say, just as a quick recap, well, what's the difference between the two? Okay, the difference between the two. That which is غير معقول المعنى, why is it that there's 5 daily prayers instead of 3, instead of 4, instead of 7? We don't know. That's the way that the Prophet ﷺ gave them to us. Why is it that there's different numbers of rak'ahs? 2 for Fajr, 4 for Dhuhr and Asr, 3 for Maghrib, 4 for Isha. Why aren't they all the same? We don't know. We can't use our mind to try to say, oh, because that's why this one has that many, that one has the other. We can't arrive at that. That's something that is غير معقول المعنى, it's ta'abbudi. It is a way that we worship Allah Azza wa Jal by submitting to the teaching without being able to comprehend or understand it. But with regards to, for example, another pillar of the 5 pillars of Islam, as zakah, the giving of charity, well, that's something that is clearly ma'qul al-ma'na. This is something that is mu'allal, something that we can understand the reasons for, we can understand the causes, and we come to see that it is something that benefits the person themselves by purifying what they may have of greed, as well as what they may have had of earnings that were not all necessarily permissible and clear, that they're also to help alleviate what there is of suffering within society, that they're there to help financially those that are impoverished, those that are deprived, those that are struggling, the categories that are mentioned. So those are the 2 categories. So they're looking at, those scholars, that group of scholars is looking at this position, saying that it is ta'abbudi, that it is like the 5 daily prayers. We don't know why there's 5, but we accept it as such. We pray, and we can't understand the number why. Well, what about the other scholars? He says, وَمَنْ كَرِهَ الْمَاءَ الْقَلِيلَ تَحُلُّهُ النَّجَاسَةُ الْيَسِيرَةُ جَمَعَ بَيْنَ الْأَحَادِيثِ فَإِنَّهُ حَمَلَ حَدِيثَيَّ أَبِي هُرَيْرَةَ عَلَى الْكَرَاهَةِ وحمل حديث الأعرابية وحديث أبي سعيد على ظاهرهما أعني على الإجزاء. He says, as far as the scholars who dislike that even a small amount of an impurity is going to become mixed into a small quantity of water, or they combine between the 2 ahadith of Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu as being disliked. Not that it's a prohibition, but that it's disliked. So it shouldn't be done. It's disliked, not that it's prohibited. So it's like one thing that the Prophet ﷺ is saying, don't do, meaning that it's prohibited. And it's another thing that he's saying, don't do it, to show that it's not good, that it's disliked, but not that it's actually a prohibition. And then he says they then also looked at the hadith of Abu Sa'id and the Bedouin radiallahu ta'ala anhum, and they say that those hadith are showing that it is permissible, that there is nothing that will make the water itself impure. So here you have another interpretation in the way that they're trying to make sense of these sets of ahadith. Those that on one hand say don't do it, and the others that show that nothing makes water impure, that water always remains pure. And again, logically, rationally, we're going to look at this and say, wait a minute, there's a contradiction here. Right? And this is the issue with most of the time folks who they will come across something of, whether it be Quran in and of itself, or whether it be within the Sunnah in and of itself, or between the Quran and Sunnah, and say, look, there's contradictions. And because of that, they'll come to whatever conclusion in their heads that they come to say that must mean that, the religion is not correct, that there's mistakes, that religion is made up, and who knows what of stuff. Number one, people should humble themselves because they are not the ultimate intelligence by which they are going to read and understand whatever the texts are, and that they're going to be the definitive voice in whatever conclusion they've reached. So that's the first thing, is a person needs to humble themselves and recognize that, look, whatever intelligence they have, they're not the supreme intelligence. There's going to be other people that may have very valid, and do have very valid, different opposing viewpoints and positions on how they make sense and interpret the same thing. So these scholars, rahmatullahi alayhim, they're saying, look, there's no contradiction. The ahadith of Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, where the Prophet ﷺ said, none of you should urinate in standing water and then purify themselves with it, that's not saying it's a prohibition. That's telling us it's disliked. So it's almost as though this is something to deal with etiquettes, something to deal with manners, something to deal with hygiene, but not something that is to the level of it being something that if you were to do that the water becomes impure and then you cannot purify yourself for worship. How did they come to that conclusion? Because they looked at the other hadith, the hadith of the Bedouin who urinated in the masjid, and all they did was take something of a pot or something of a container with water, pour it over that spot, and that's it. The ground was clear, the water purified the spot, and they were able to pray on that spot, as well as the well. So they're saying, no, this is telling us that the first is saying it's just something disliked, but that it is permissible because these other hadiths show that the impurity, regardless of how much it is, it does not make the water impure. And he goes on to say, وَأَمَّا الشَّافِعِيَّةُ وَأَبُو حَنِيفَةَ. Now mind you, the first two positions were especially held by Imam Malik rahmatullahi alayhi, and he held a position in all of these three different opinions. The third, he says, وَأَمَّا الشَّافِعِيُّ وَأَبُو حَنِيفَةَ رَحْمَةُ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِمَا فجمع بين حديثي أبي هريرة وحديث أبي سعيد الخدري بأن حمل حديثي أبي هريرة على الماء القليل وحديث أبي سعيد على الماء الكثير. So here's the third perspective. He says the scholars of Ash-Shafi'i and Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhima, what they did and how they combined between the sources was that they took the hadith of Abu Hurairah and the hadith of Abu Sa'id and said the hadith of Abu Hurairah is talking about a small quantity of water. The hadith of Abu Sa'id, the well, is talking about an exorbitant amount of water, a large quantity of water. فذهب الشافعي إلى أن الحد في ذلك الذي يجمع الأحاديث هو ما ورد في حديث عبد الله بن عمر رضي الله تعالى عنهما عن أبيه الذي خرجه أبو داود والترمذي وصححه محمد بن حزم قال صلى الله عليه وسلم سئل رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم عن الماء وما ينوبه من السباع والدواب فقال صلى الله عليه وسلم إن كان الماء قلتين لم يحمل خبثا. He says, so Imam Shafi'i rahmatullahi alayhi now, in putting something of a differentiator between how do you tell what is a little bit of water as opposed to a lot, he says that he's looking at the hadith that Abdullah ibn Umar, may Allah Azza wa Jalla be pleased with both of them, wherein he said that the Prophet ﷺ was asked about, the Messenger ﷺ was asked about the water that wild animals and things of that sort that they're drinking from, that they're using. And he ﷺ said, if the water is qullatayn, and that's a measurement that he has given, that is an adjective to show a quantity. If it is that level, lam yahmil khabatha. He says it cannot become impure. And if you recall, and we'll talk a little bit about it in the next section here, is the next sentence here. But there was a difference of opinion. How do you measure that? And remember that the likes of Abu Hanifa rahimahullah said that if you were to put your hand or move it, that body of water from one side, that the doppel effect, the waves would not reach the other side. That's how he measured that quantity of qullatayn, while others gave an actual numbered measure of ratl, of whatever the pounds were, from what was familiar to them in their time. So he then says, وَأَمَّا أَبُو حَنِيفَةَ رَحِمَهُ اللَّهِ فَذَهَبَ إِلَىٰ أَنَّ الْحَدَّ فِي ذَلِكَ هُوَ جِهَةُ الْقِيَاسِ وذلك أنه اعتبر سريان النجاسة في جميع الماء بسريان الحركة فإذا كان الماء بحيث يظن أن النجاسة لا يمكن فيها أن تسري في جميعه فالماء طاهر. So he's saying here with regards to Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, he's using qiyas. He's using this agreed upon tool within usul al-fiqh that is referred to as dalil, that qiyas, this logical, rational tool and method, that it is evidence. And the way that it works is that you take something that is already established and clear and it is good, that there's evidence for it and there's no difference of opinion on the ruling. For example, Allah Azza wa Jal says with regards to al-khamr that it is haram, and the Prophet ﷺ has also declared that khamr is haram. The ulama have found that the illah, that the cause, the reason for intoxicants being haram is because the way they affect the faculties of the mind as well as the body in a bad way, that they detriment, that they inhibit, that they slow down, that they don't allow for the clarity of thought, and so on. So now, what happens? Something new comes. What happens that there's this new flower that people have found, and that if they eat it, or that they smell it and snort it, or whatever they do, that all of a sudden this plant, it intoxicates. Do we say that we don't have a ruling for it? Scholars say no, everything has a ruling in Islam. So they study it, they look at it, they find out that this plant is an intoxicant. And so they say this intoxicates in the same way that alcohol, for example, intoxicates, and we know that alcohol is haram, therefore this plant is also haram. That's qiyas. He's telling us that Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi, he's using qiyas, but he's using qiyas in a different way. He's using it in the sense of the property of the water. He's saying that if a person were to understand that water itself, when they're going to move it, that they're going to put some action into it, that it's going to travel and it's going to reach the other side, then the impurity that is put in that water is also going to travel in the same way, such that it is going to then permeate that whole body of water. I repeat that again. How do you tell whether the water is of the quantity that it becomes impure or not impure? If I were to imagine that this here is a bucket of water, a bathtub of water. If I splashed on this side, what's going to happen to this side of the tub? There's going to be waves. But imagine now this whole masjid is a swimming pool. and I'm splashing and I'm splashing and I'm splashing and I stop. Are there going to be waves on the other end? No. So he's saying that in this smaller quantity of water, in the same way that the waves of the water travel, the impurity would also travel. It's going to permeate it because it's small. It's not a large quantity. But in the larger quantity, in the same way that the water itself could not travel, the waves could not travel from one side to the other, because the water is so much that the impurity would also itself not travel. That's the qiyas he's making. What else? ولكن من ذهب هذين المذهبين فحديث الأعرابي المشهور معارض له ولا بد. فلذلك لجأت الشافعية إلى أن فرقت بين ورود الماء على النجاسة وورودها على الماء، فقالوا إن ورد عليها الماء كما في حديث الأعرابي لم ينجس أو لم ينجس، وإن وردت النجاسة على الماء كما في حديث أبي هريرة نجس. So he's saying, but there's something of a problem here with regards to the two madhabs of Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Ash-Shafi'i. And he's saying that there is a contradiction, at least in the way that Imam Ibn Rushd sees it. Now mind you, Imam Ibn Rushd was a scholar in the way that many of these scholars who are specialists in Arabic language, in Islamic law, in usul al-fiqh, and they also studied, and he was a scholar in logic, in debate, in philosophy. He's the one that is referred to in the Latin as Averroes, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Europe, Averroes? I stand corrected, Averroes. Thank you. He's the one who, among many, but he's the one who, with regards to the passing on of many of the philosophy scholars and books that came from the Greeks and others to the Europeans, he's credited as being basically kind of like the student of Aristotle. Of course, he did not meet Aristotle, there was a long time between them. But the level of scholarship that he had. So he's, as far as his, critical thinking and his higher ordered thinking, he's looking at it and he's saying that, no, there is a contradiction. And he says that's why the Shafi'i scholars, they make a differentiation. They look at the hadith of the Bedouin and say that the difference is, in the hadith of the Bedouin, it is water that is being introduced to the impurity, and that's why the water does not become impurified. But in the hadith of the well, not the well, pardon me. Yeah, the hadith of Abu Hurairah, Jazakumullah khairan. He says it is the impurity that is being introduced into the water, and that's why the water becomes impure. Now, when you look at some of this stuff, maybe you're thinking right now, what's the difference? You still have two things that are being mixed with each other, right? Whether you take the water and you pour it into whatever there is of the impurity, or vice versa, the result is the same, right? But again, if they're looking at it also from the perspective of it being something that is ta'abbudi, something that is an act of worship, it's not something that is necessarily a rational, logical one, they can look at this and for them it can make complete sense. To be very honest, and I'm not in any way to the capacity of these scholars, but I don't see any difference between whether you have two vessels. This one has urine, this one has water. If you take the water and dump it all into the urine, that makes it pure and it's good. But that if you did the exact opposite, the same quantities of water and the same quantities of urine, but you poured the urine into the water, that makes the water impure. I don't see that any of that makes a difference. So either you're going to hold the belief to say that it's ta'abbudi, so it makes no difference this way or that way, in the way that Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah is saying, or that you're going to make that differentiation in the way that the likes of Imam Malik rahmatullahi alayhi, where he's saying the hadiths of Abu Hurairah are saying it's disliked, not haram, not prohibited, disliked, makruh, because we see that the other hadith of the Bedouin and of the well, that shows that it is permissible. Well, let's keep going. He says, وقال جمهور الفقهاء هذا تحكم وله إذا تؤمل وجه من النظر وذلك أنهم إنما صاروا إلى الإجماع على أن النجاسة اليسيرة لا تؤثر في الماء الكثير إذا كان الماء الكثير بحيث يتوهم أن النجاسة لا تسري في جميع أجزائه وأنه يستحيل عينها عن الماء الكثير وإذا كان ذلك كذلك فلا يبعد أن قدرا من الماء لو حله قدر ماء من النجاسة لسرت فيه ولا كان نجسا فإذا ورد ذلك الماء على النجاسة جزءا فجزءا فمعلوم أنها تفني عين تلك النجاسة وتذهب قبل فناء ذلك الماء وعلى هذا فيكون آخر جزء ورد من ذلك الماء قد طهر المحل لأن نسبته إلى ما ورد عليه مما بقي من النجاسة نسبة الماء الكثير إلى القليل من النجاسة ولذلك كان العلم يقع في هذه الحال بذهاب عين النجاسة أعني في وقوع الجزء الأخير الطاهر على آخر جزء يبقى من عين النجاسة ولهذا أجمعوا على أن مقدار ما يتوضأ به يطهر قطر البول الواقعة في الثوب أو البدن واختلفوا إذا وقعت القطرة من البول في ذلك القدر من الماء. So he's saying that the majority of the scholars are saying that in the way that this is being interpreted by the Shafi'iyya, that this interpretation, that there needs to be consideration and a better analysis of it. He's saying because there's already ijma' among the scholars that a small quantity of impurity does not make the water impure. There's already ijma' in that. And what we also come to understand is that that small quantity of the impurity, when it is introduced into the water, that the water dissolves it, it disappears. And the Arabic term that they use for this is al-istihala. Yahullu fi, meaning that it becomes absorbed or dissolved into it so much so that it no longer remains. Right? So you take, for example, that quantity of urine, for example, and you put it inside that bucket of water. When you no longer see anything of the color of the urine, it means that the water has completely overwhelmed whatever the impurity was. So the impurity is no longer existent, it's no longer an issue. And they're also looking at it saying the same thing is true when the water itself is also poured onto the source of where the impurity is, as was the case with the Bedouin who urinated in the masjid. They're saying that as that water is coming into contact with the urine, it is once again breaking it down piece by piece, bit by bit, dissolving it until with the last bit of water that is introduced to it, poured onto it, nothing is left from the impurity, and all that remains is pure. And with that, we come to the conclusion of all that we were going to cover tonight. And inshallah next week what we're going to do is look a bit at what he himself gives of his position with regards to these differences from the scholars, and conclude inshallah what is left with regards to this particular topic. And don't forget that this is just the first of several, and it is with regards to water that has something of an impurity that is introduced to it or that is mixed with it. Does it cause the water to become impure? And we're not talking about a small quantity, because there's already consensus among the scholars that that's not at all an issue. But we're talking about with a larger quantity of water, and this is where there are differences. What is that quantity of water that is larger, and so on. And with that, we'll pause. We'll have the adhan called, inshallah azza wa jalla. Then if there's any questions, we'll address any questions that there may be, inshallah. Wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu an la أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر، الله أكبر. لا
ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله رضيت بالله ربا بالإسلام دينا بمحمد صلى الله عليه وسلم رسوله نبيا. Any questions on tonight's section, inshallah? Any questions, inshallah? Going once, going twice. Soul to the highest bidder. Alhamdulillah. Wa jazakumullahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.